Welcome to the Children's Tradition Podcast, where we introduce families to the poetic life.
Hello, my name is Amanda Foss. I am a homeschool mom of 6, the writer of the Children's Tradition classical curriculum, and I want you to know that you do not need to buy every book that you see being advertised to you at the local bookstore or online to give your children a quality education. Education is ideal in the classical mode is ideally about giving your children the best that has been thought and said, handed down through history. We are constantly being marketed to buy this new curriculum, buy this new book, do this new thing. And yet, if you have a tradition, what's so just freeing about that is that you can, instead of, getting overwhelmed by all the options out there, you can have a clear plumb line of this is what I need, and this is going to give my children everything they need for a quality education. Even going back to before formal lessons begin, if you have a nursery student, a child who is younger than 7 years old, there are books that are suited and have been handed down even for them over the past couple hundred of years. Really, we could summarize what kind of books do our children need? Well, they need the best ones. They need quality classics that are going to then give them three things that will help them in their future. So what are these three things? The first one is it's going to give them beautiful language. If you have ever read a Beatrix Potter book or maybe a Randolph Caldecott book, picture book, right? These are picture books. You will very quickly find that the vocabulary, the eloquence, often the poetry is a much higher level than anything your children would encounter if you just went and grabbed like the typical, picture books or even cardboard books that are being sold, at your local Target. You cannot replace the beauty and eloquence of classics children's literature. And why does this matter? Well, your children will only be able to form thoughts with the vocabulary they have. So the deadening of vocabulary over time, what's happening right now in our time and place is that people's vocabulary is getting dumber and dumber and dumber. It's dumbed down, right? This is one of the reasons why the newspaper has to be written at an 8th grade level, right? At the level of middle schoolers, because the average person does not have the vocabulary that, say, 100 or 200 years ago, English speakers had. Well, what does this do to your thoughts? Well, it constricts them, right? Your thoughts will then be constricted by the limitations of your capacity to articulate ideas. And so from a young age, we want our children's world to be filled with a rich vocabulary. And because we ourselves are products of modernity, we probably don't have a super wide vocabulary ourselves. And so, well, how do we give our children something we don't have? Well, we read them classic children's literature because it will give them this rich language. And the more you are reading these picture books, and beginning in the early years, reading these picture books to your children, that is going to shape the vocabulary of your family. So you as the parent will be growing in a knowledge of good words, your children will be growing, and together you will collectively be able to have that aspect of your soul expanded because your capacity for thought is expanded. The second thing about quality children's literature is that it is forming their moral imagination. So a lot of children's books today are at best amoral, right? They're not really communicating anything significant about morality. At worst, they can be immoral, that they're trying to, for example, make the self and your, basically your own self-expression as if that's the highest expression of virtue, to just merely, look into yourself and have yourself be the guide, which is the most destructive lie of Satan that we could be giving to children, right? Be wise in your own eyes, trust in yourself, let your heart be your guide, right? These are the themes that are so common in children's literature in modernity. So to avoid that, by going back to old books, by the ones, again, that have stood the test of time, we are able to pass on a moral framework that is not one that is didactic yet. If you're talking about a nursery child or even a school years student, which would be like 3rd grade to 7th grade, probably the first couple years of the school years, it's still not, they're not having a very intense rational engagement with the stories, right? It's much more pre-rational. They're just taking those stories into their heart, and it's forming inside of them on an intuitive level a sense of this is good and this is bad. Witches are bad. This is right, the power of fairy tales, right? Witches are bad. Youngest sons who choose virtue over, power and selfish gain, they're good, right? These are like part of the moral framework of the fairy tale. But this extends through not just fairy tales, but also to poetry and to novels and things that have now made it, again, hundreds of years, and therefore are much more deeply rooted in a objective view of morality that is so lost on us in a postmodern world. The third reason why children need classic children's literature, and not just, any book will do, is because classic children's literature actually is a gateway to the best literature that has ever been written, often called the great books. Well, what are the great books? The great books would be the books that have had, and more broadly, I should say, the stories and the writings. The stories and the writings that have had the greatest impact on human history, particularly for us in the West. We're going to focus on the Western tradition, right? So in the Western world, the writings of Plato, the writings of Shakespeare, right? Homer. These are great books that have been so influential that we would call them great. We would say, yeah, like you can't understand the Western world if you don't have a knowledge of Plato, of Augustine, of Aquinas, right? If you're in the West, whether or not you agree with him, you need to know Aquinas to understand why we think the way we think, right? So all of those pieces go together to give an idea of, well, we need these, the great books are this, well, here's like the imagination of the Western world. But those are really hard to read, right? Those are not easy. And so the best way, especially if you just pick one of those up and you have no background in reading classic children's literature, you're going to struggle because you won't have the vocabulary or the imaginative framework to comprehend what those stories are about. Doesn't mean you won't get anything out of them. Of course you'll get something out of them, but you will be restricted. You'll be restricted to the degree that you are missing things in the soil of your heart, which is the image I want you to think of for this idea of good books as preparation for the great books. Now, I get that idea from John Senior. His 1,000 good books list is the foundation for the children's tradition curriculum. And the reason for that is because the 1,000 good books, they're not actually 1,000, by the way, it's just an expression. But the 1,000 good books is these stories that are the essential stories you would need to be prepared to engage with the great books well. So this 1,000 good books list is made up of two things. It's made up of the stories that great books writers themselves would have known and engaged with. So this would be the realm of fairy tales, myths, and legends, right? Fairy tales, myths, and legends have been forming the Western imagination for thousands of years. So while we will get them in a book, right? Like, oh, this is the household stories of Grimm's translated by Lucy Crane, which is a translation from about 150 years ago. Okay, if we're using that, then we think of it as a book. But what the whole point of what the Grimm's brothers were doing was traveling around to, German towns and collecting oral tales as they'd been told. And basically they were looking for like a through line of different stories. So they caught on that there was like variations of different stories, and then they would pick a version that they thought was the most, faithful to the heart of the story. But fairy tales have been being handed down, again, thousands of years. There is, if I'm not mistaken, there's like Mesopotamian tablet that has like a Cinderella fairy tale on it, right? So the idea is that the great books writers, right? Homer would have known Aesop's Fables, for example. So the Aesop's Fables are on the 1,000 good books list. Fairy tales, myths, right? The myths of the Greek gods. You can't escape or understand the great books writers a lot of the time. Take, for example, a peak Christian writing like Paradise Lost or Divine Comedy. Both Paradise Lost and Divine Comedy are assuming you really know your Greek mythology. It's in Roman mythology. It's just the assumption, right? So those would be examples of things where you need to know those things as like background information, the same way that the great books writers themselves had that knowledge as background information, and that will then equip you to understand great books later as you get older, as your children, as they get older. Secondly, the good books are books where the writers themselves were well versed in the great books, and therefore it flowed into their writing. So these would be in more of like the novel genre. The novel as we know it is only a few hundred years old. So, but novels like writers like Louisa May Alcott, writers like Alexander Dumas, these are people who, yes, their books, we wouldn't put them on the level of great in the sense of that they have, impacted the entire world with ideas to the same degree as more philosophical texts, but they embody very profound ideas that are absolutely rooted in the Western tradition. And through reading them in a much more approachable way, because they're a story, you get to take those ideas in through story, which is just easier to digest on a spiritual and emotional level than, say, starting with philosophical tomes. The image with all this is that of soil, that your heart is like soil, which of course we get that from scripture. That is a biblical imagery, that your heart is like soil. And the way we might think of good books is that the good books are the humus, right? If you're familiar with gardening at all, humus is that dark organic matter that is necessary in the soil. It's actually alive, right? It has like living organisms. It's a mixture of dead and living things. But if you don't have healthy humus in your soil, then the roots of a plant have nothing to grab onto. So it's really necessary in gardening to make sure your soil is healthy, because if you have dead soil that's dry, crumbly, doesn't have this living organic matter, then the roots will actually have nothing to grab on. And when a plant grows up, it'll grow up and then it'll just topple over because there's nothing to hold on to. So you'll find in videos that I am going to be making in the future, this video, that I will often talk about the cultural soil. But we're also going to talk about the heart soil, because the soil of your heart is, the cultural soil is basically the pattern by which the individual soul soils, whatever's going into the individual soils of the souls in a culture, that is what makes up the cultural soil, right? This is like a pattern, right? There's the pattern of the person, and then it expands to the level of society, and so on. But the idea of soil is central to how we think about this. So this is why books that are just dumb books, or books that are, bad vocabulary, or just skimming the surface, right? A lot of times, especially in modernity and with homeschool curriculums, there's a tendency to want to do modern books because they're easier to understand, right? So, well, if we just read these modern books, I can teach my kid about this event that happened, for example, by using these easier books, these new books, because they're going to be much more, understandable to us. And on the one hand, that's true. If the goal was merely to absorb information about an event, you can transmit information much more easily by putting it in the vocabulary that is, a lower level vocabulary that is more common in our own day. But what you're missing out on is the depth and richness of that preparation, again, for the great books, that deep formation of the moral imagination that is going so much deeper beyond the surface than you realize, and that beautiful language. When it comes to that going deeper beyond the surface than you realize, C.S. Lewis talks about how the best children's books are the ones that are enjoyed by adults and children alike. And so this should be a guiding light for you, not only in looking at, well, has this book stood the test of time, but in the ability for a book to give you delight and joy as an adult just as much as your children. If you've read Winnie the Pooh, you will know, which is, again, one of the 1,000 good books, you will know how delightful a children's book can be to you as an adult. This is just the way they are made. They are so life-giving and they're so profound in a way that they are feeding the soul of the child, but they are not feeding the soul in a way that is going to stop merely because of their age, right? So can feed your child's soul, but it can feed your soul as well. So I want to end with giving you some examples of what good books by age might look like. So if you have a nursery child, that would be a child who is under 7 years old. So they may have begun formal lessons, maybe they haven't, right? Depending on your approach. But whether or not they have started formal lessons, they should be reading quality children's literature like Beatrix Potter, like Kate Greenaway, like Randolph Caldecott. Once they are in the upper range of nursery, you might decide to include things like Grimm's fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen, poetry, Mother Goose, All of these things are things that are so helpful to building up that all the things that we just talked about. If your child is school years, this is going to be the time for things like Charles and Mary Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, Frances Hodgson's Burnett, Secret Garden, Little Lord Fauntleroy, Rudyard Kipling, right? He wrote The Jungle Book, Captain Courageous. There's Charles Kingsley, who wrote Water Babies, Westward Ho. As you get into the older school years, writers like Louisa May Alcott. For history, G.A. Henty. I'm trying to remember right now. Let's see, it's Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. So Howard Pyle would be a wonderful one. These are people who have all of these rich stories that are going to prepare your child for continuing to go deeper into great literature that will continue to deepen their soul, continue to expand their vocabulary, continue to build out their moral framework for reality and what it is. And that is all then leading up to adolescence, where they will engage with writers like Alexander Dumas, like Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, Anna Karenina, right? It's definitely some Leo Tolstoy. So much more challenging reads, but ones that are full of so much rich imagery, so many rich themes that, again, if we can start when they're young and then continue to just add in these books as they get older, then they will be prepared for the great books eventually as they get up into upper high school and college. I'll just end with this thought, which is to say that wherever you are, let's say you're watching this video and your child is 10 and you're like, oh, well, we didn't do any of those books when they were a nursery student. Have no fear. It's okay. What is so inspiring is that John Sr. and 2 other professors who were a part of what was called the Integrated Humanities Program. That was a program that was basically designed to help college level students who were supposed to be studying the great books, and they did study the great books, but to help fill in the imaginative gaps that they had in their knowledge that was keeping them from having a deep engagement with the great books. Now, that does not mean that the 1,000 Good Books is only for those who intend to study the great books. Many people might be satisfied and blessed just for their entire life to focus on only the good books. But for those who do intend to go on to the great books, the IHP is an example of how even if you were as an adult at the college level, or maybe you're a parent and you're realizing, yeah, I haven't really read Mother Goose, haven't really read Carlo Collodi, haven't really read Beatrix Potter even, like whatever it is, now is the time. It's okay. We all have to begin where we are. And rather than focusing on regret of, oh, I wish I had done X, Y, Z, we all have to act with the knowledge we have. And so whether you are finding out about this idea of the good books as preparation for the great books when your child is a toddler, or whether you're finding out when they are 15, it is not too late for you to start incorporating into the atmosphere of your family these older books that can then be a part of your family's imaginative framework and prepare them to have a rich and deep soul that will be prepared for life, for whatever God has for them in the future. So I hope this video is helpful and encouraging, and I will be back in a few weeks.